Once you have leaky gut, you've lost your border control. Now, things that are not supposed to get through are going to get through. And one of those things that can get through even more easily is that endotoxin. And the endotoxin is going to stimulate your white blood cells. It's going to make them secrete all sorts of inflammatory substances. You're not going to feel like you have a cold or flu, but your brain is going to be foggy.
Yep.
You're going to feel tired. You're going to feel achy. Maybe your joints don't feel good. Maybe you're gaining weight. So there's different pathways to leaky gut. But once you have leaky gut, then that is an overriding condition that is behind almost every single chronic inflammatory disease that we face.
Health, fitness, mindset, nutrition. Live better and longer. I'm Saad Alam, and let's hone in. Dr. Vincent Pedre, we are so excited to have you here with us. And I want to start this off on one very specific question. Why is gut health all of a sudden so incredibly important in 2023 to us?
Oh man, that's a big question. Gut health has always been important. And if we go back over 100 years, when the style of medicine in the country was more naturopathic medicine and not the allopathic pharmaceutical-driven medicine that we have right now, we knew how important the gut was and foundational to our health. The problem is that along the way it was lost. And then we became this pharmaceutical-driven medical system that was treating symptoms. There wasn't a lot of information about the gut microbiome when I went to medical school. And I have to say, I can't even remember that they even mentioned it. It was not even a mention. And yet over the last 20 years, there has been an explosion of research on the microbiome, on many different microbiomes and how it affects us. Research in mice, germ-free mice, looking at what happens when you introduce certain gut microbes into them and how do they react. And so I think that it's been a natural evolution that has mirrored the rise of knowledge from free access to the internet, functional medicine. I think people looking for root cause, like people just feeling frustrated that the regular medical system does not have the best answers for chronic disease. And on top of that, we have to also overlay the rising use of pesticides. We're using billions of pounds of pesticide, glyphosate. So all of that, along with the advent of antibiotics and the rising use of antibiotics, not just in the US, here it's controlled. You have to get a doctor's prescription for an antibiotic, but as soon as you go outside of the US, you can walk into a pharmacy and just get an antibiotic. In a lot of countries without a prescription. So I think there's a lot of uninformed use of antibiotics that's decimating people's gut microbiome. And that leads to a whole host of gut problems that then is like the first domino in a line of dominoes that then leads to a whole host of body-wide issues, because once you decimate the microbiome through too much exposure to antibiotics, pesticides, all that, then you get leaky gut. Leaky gut is basically like opening up the gates to all of the inflammatory substances that are being kept in the gut, protected from us. And once that stuff starts getting into the body, then it activates your immune system, it activates all sorts of inflammatory cascades, and then you start seeing different chronic inflammatory diseases in different people depending on their susceptibility. So I think all of these reasons, we are basically, I think, in a very, very strong transition point in medicine where we weren't paying attention to what was right under our noses. Now we've kind of really come to appreciate, and the science is catching up, because back 100 plus years ago, we didn't have the science to prove why the gut was that important. And now the science is catching up and showing that, yeah, leaky gut does exist, that the microbiome does matter. And we look at all of these different gut bugs and their roles, and even just understanding that there are different microbiomes depending on where in the world you live, what types of foods you eat, and even looking at, okay, what is it about the microbiome that can either promote longevity or reduce your longevity? What role does that play? And how does that differ in different parts of the world depending, there's blue zones in Sardinia, in Costa Rica, in Okinawa, Japan. They're not eating the same foods. So their microbiomes are not exactly the same, but there are some commonalities about how the microbiome of a centenarian is operating compared to somebody who's at 80 years old and taking 10 different medications and it's totally inflamed and it's got diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and all these chronic health issues that we see in the Western world. So I think it's a confluence of all of these factors. And the other piece of it is, I think we can't discount the rising aggregate stress in the world. I think also having so much stimulation at our fingertips has created a world where probably the stress levels are much higher because we're never apart from our smartphones.
Yep.
We need to recognize how all of these things are filtering down and affecting our bodies. And one of the biggest places that we feel our stress is in our gut. You can think about like when you were a kid, like if you had a test, you had a competition, you might feel some butterflies in the stomach, you might feel uneasy, you might get a little bit of loose stools, you might have to run to the bathroom. And that's because there's such a strong gut-brain connection. And I think our nervous systems are hyper-stimulated right now in our modern world.
I almost want to take a couple steps back and assume that there's someone that's always wondered, what the hell is a microbiome? What is even a leaky gut? Let's break them down into their component parts and let's build the story up so we can get a little bit more clarity. And let's even start there. What the hell is a microbiome?
Basically the summation of all the microorganisms that exist on or inside the body, which are mainly bacteria, but can also be yeast, parasites, worms, all sorts of singular cellular organisms. And we've got microbiomes that live on our skin, in our mouth, inside the airways, in all sorts of orifices, intravaginal microbiome, which is really important. But when we talk about, or when I talk about the microbiome, mostly what I'm talking about is the microbiome that's inside of us, inside the gut, because that is the biggest reservoir of the microbiome, especially in the large intestine where there's up to 100 trillion bacterial species. So it outnumbers our own cells, and the aggregate DNA of that microbiome outnumbers our DNA, I think, about 100 to 1. So we're actually these super organisms that are vehicles for these little microbes to live and replicate, and they play an extremely important role in our health.
So they're using us to have a party every single day, but that number is mind-boggling.
If you look at it that way, you can think that we're just really vehicles for the microbiome to replicate itself.
That's it.
And pass itself on from human to human. It makes you think like, well, where is the real programming coming from? And when you look at human genetics, we've got this big genetic code, but they estimate that we're only really expressing 2% of the genes in the code. So there's a lot of just filler code that may be serving other functions. But they've looked at that and thought that there's actually not enough genes to create all the proteins that are necessary for life, that we depend on the microbiome to come in and bridge the gap through what we call postbiotic products. So they're products of the metabolism of the bacteria that live in the gut that then get absorbed into our bodies and regulate things like our insulin sensitivity, our blood sugar levels, things like even your ability to learn. The ability to form new memory in the brain is influenced by the gut microbiome.
Oh, wow. And so really, we are dependent upon our microbiome to function appropriately. And frankly, that means we should be taking uber care of them, because not having them creates a lot of problems for us.
We should be thinking about how should you eat in order to support your microbiome. I know everybody thinks about like, how do we eat to be healthy, to have good heart health, to have low blood sugar. But really, I almost think of this meme in my head, and it's human as this super organism, and then it's like a spaceship, and in the head You've got the little microbes actually are in the control panel pulling the levers and controlling things. I know it's an oversimplification, but in many ways, I think for so many years, like we even thought like diabetes is an issue with the pancreas. And yet now we're understanding that metabolic syndrome and blood sugar control is modulated by the gut microbiome. So it's not just the pancreas. We have to think of the gut microbiome as almost like an accessory organ of the body that is metabolically active, that helps us metabolize our hormones, that produces its own set of postbiotic products like short-chain fatty acids that have a whole host of very important influences in the body that could either be good or be bad, depending on the gut bugs and the type of postbiotic products that they are producing. But the important takeaway is that they play a much more important role in our health than we have given credence to in the history of medicine up until now.
So you have a collection of bugs and all kinds of, I guess, what's the right word to describe it? If you had to say there are 5 things in our microbiome, what are they?
We've got bacteria.
Okay.
Right, we've got another set of bacteria that are called archaea, which are kind of like bacteria, but they're not quite bacteria. Then we've got yeast, we have parasites, we have singular cellular protozoa maybe. You might have a worm in there, just don't know. A lot of us are carrying parasites that are either causing a problem or may not be causing a problem at a certain moment. Certainly parasites are not good and can cause a lot of disruption. So basically think of it as this ecosystem.
Okay.
So kind of like a rainforest. You have this incredible ecosystem inside your gut. And that ecosystem, just like a rainforest, when it's in balance, it works well. Like I don't know if you ever saw the documentary, The Biggest Little Farm.
No, but I'm gonna.
And it's a documentary about they recreated a farm on this land where the soil was unfarmable. So it was this whole process of recreating an entire ecosystem. And they realized how everything served a purpose. So even having some, I think they had coyotes. So even having the coyotes, which is a predator, was an important balancing part of the ecosystem. So same thing in the gut. We've got a certain number of quote unquote bad bugs. And I think I think we have to evolve our understanding of, are they really bad, or are they just bad if they overgrow? But are they good in a certain percentage? Because part of the work that I did when I was looking and doing research for my new book, The Gut Smart Protocol, I had the opportunity to go on this trip to Africa. And I went with a small group, and part of the trip was to go meet and stay with the Hadza, one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes on the planet. Now, why was I so interested in going to Africa and hanging out with these hunter-gatherers? It's because someone had the foresight to ask the question, I wonder what's in their poop. Because they haven't been on antibiotics, they don't have diabetes, they don't have obesity, they don't have cardiovascular disease, they don't have dementia, they're quite healthy, and they're these hunter-gatherers who don't have access to modern conveniences, and the types of foods that they eat are pretty limited given that they're hunting and gathering, so they get what's available.
In Africa, out of all places.
Yeah. It's in the eastern part of Africa, in Tanzania, Kenya, that whole area. The really cool thing is that they looked and they did studies on their gut microbiome and looked at what type of bacteria do they have. Are they similar? They are basically a human time capsule into what has been the history of humanity. For 95% of our history, we were hunter-gatherers. It's only in this last part of our history, in the last couple of thousands of years, it's only this last part where we started domesticating plants, animals, and leaving our hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But we were hunter-gatherers for thousands of years before the last 2,000 to 3,000 years. So it's like going in a human time capsule. They're not exposed to antibiotics for the most part. There might be some exceptions, but mostly they haven't been exposed to antibiotics. So you can look at, well, what happened? What does a gut look like for hunter-gatherer who hasn't been exposed to antibiotics? And the interesting thing is they have some bugs that if I took that bug and put it into your gut, would probably make you extremely sick because they are what we would consider certain bad bugs, like a treponema, which is the bacteria, the spirochete that causes syphilis. And yet, in them, it doesn't cause any manifestations of the disease. So then they ask, well, what does this gut bug do? The treponema is actually quite skilled at breaking down plant fibers. And since they eat a very high fiber diet, that treponema is helping break down those fibers so they can use them for energy. So it's quite fascinating, so when we're defining what is bad, what is good, I think it depends on the scenario, the condition of the person. Obviously their gut is skilled and capable of tolerating being out and eating things without washing them.
Yep.
So they have this very resistant, resilient gut that is capable of handling probably exposure to a whole host of types of organisms that we would not be able to handle.
Thinking through that everyone is so different, is it a fair statement to say that there are different gut microbiomes in different, I would even say, hyper-regional areas of the world?
Yeah, because it depends on what are the most predominant foods that people are eating in those parts of the world. Are they eating a very high fiber plant-based diet? Are they eating more animal protein? Depending on the types of foods that you're eating, that's going to influence the type of gut bugs that are in there because they are designed to feed off of the foods that you're eating. So it's going to influence that. And the other interesting thing that they looked at with the Hadza is that there's a cyclical nature to their diet. Their diet is slightly different during the rainy season versus the dry season.
That makes sense, yep.
And with the changes in diet, they saw there were shifts in the microbiome. And sometimes certain gut bugs actually that were present during, let's say, the rainy season seemed to disappear during the dry season, almost thinking that, okay, they're not eating those foods, they're losing those bugs, but there apparently was always a reservoir because in the next rainy season, when they start eating more of the foods,
they come back.
During the rainy season, then those bugs come back. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I'm going to bring it back to, we kind of understand what the microbiome is. Talk to me about why all of these chemicals are actually ruining that microbiome and then how that's creating leaky gut and what is leaky gut.
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, exposure to pesticide acts like an antimicrobial. For example, glyphosate, which is one of the most widely used pesticides worldwide, like we're using billions of pounds of glyphosate. It's patented as an antimicrobial, as a chelating agent. So what it does, the way it works, is it starves the weeds of nutrients, so the weeds can't grow. But when that comes into your gut, it's starving your bacteria of nutrients as well. And it's acting almost like an antibiotic as well. So probably, you have to think of pesticides almost par to par with antibiotics. Obviously, taking an antibiotic is going to be a much stronger concentrated dose. So antibiotics are one of the biggest gut disruptors out there. But there are other things that lead to what we call leaky gut. So not just antibiotics, pesticides, but also alcohol, like overconsumption of alcohol. Any things that we consider to be accepted because you can just go to the pharmacy and just buy it without a prescription. And you think, well, this is available over the counter, so this is probably not harmful to me. It's going to help me with joint inflammation, whatever it is. So things like NSAIDs, like ibuprofen, but also even acetaminophen, Tylenol, has been found to cause alterations in the gut microbiome. Anytime you're causing a disturbance in the gut microbiome, then downstream from that, the next thing that can happen is your gut permeability increases, gets altered, because we're in this symbiotic system where the good gut bugs are helping us maintain the integrity of the gut lining.
You're saying the good gut bugs basically stay on in the interior lining of the stomach and keep all the bad gut bugs out.
There's going to be a mix of bugs. So when you start looking, and the stomach is actually a very slightly different.
Let's go large intestine.
Yeah, once we get into the large intestine, small intestine, stomach doesn't have as many bacteria, but the stomach also has specialized mechanisms for protecting the lining. And some of those mechanisms exist also in the rest of the intestine with the mucus layer, the mucin layer. And there's an interior and there's an exterior mucin layer. So most of the gut bugs should be living in the outer mucus layer. The inner mucus layer actually is protected. The body will secrete antibody molecules, IgA, from the goblet cells and the Paneth cells, and they're going to help keep that inner mucus layer free of bugs. So they live in just a really thin, nanometer thin layer all along the gut lining. And hopefully they don't live in that inner mucus layer, but a lot of people have disrupted gut or have gut issues or exposed to antibiotics or any of these things, eating foods that are high in pesticides. They can have all of that disrupted, and the mucus layer gets disrupted, and then you get leaky gut.
But if I'm understanding it's when that inner mucus layer that is basically holding the good bacteria and the bacteria from moving into the body, is it when that starts to break down and that bacteria actually starts moving into the body?
It's part of the process, but it's not the only mechanism that can lead to leaky gut. So for example, gluten itself, the protein molecule in wheat, has the ability to stimulate the release of a communication molecule called zonulin that controls gut permeability, almost like a dimmer switch. And gluten will actually stimulate a receptor that releases zonulin and increase gut permeability independent of anything else that's going on. So there are also foods, other substances, like I mentioned, NSAIDs can increase gut permeability. The birth control pill also increases gut permeability. So a lot of women taking birth control pills start noticing that they've got like bloating, gut issues, and they might think it's the hormones. Well, it's also that it's affecting gut permeability. So as that mucus layer breaks down, then the way to imagine leaky gut is we've got this absorptive layer in the gut that's about one cell layer thick. That's it. So this really thin one cell layer thin, and then below that we have something called the lamina propria, which is kind of like a mesh matrix, and that's where the white blood cells live. That's where a lot of the immune system, the patrolling, like making sure things are not getting through that shouldn't get through. When we get leaky gut, that one cell layer thick lining starts to get disrupted. So a way to think of it, and one way that I like to make an analogy, is if you've ever been to like one of these artisanal coffee shops that makes a pour over coffee. So you have the coffee filter and it's holding the coffee grounds, and the coffee filter, imagine the coffee filter is like our gut lining. And you pour the water over, so that's akin to eating food and drinking. And then what gets through are only the nutrients, the antioxidants, the polyphenols, that beautiful coffee-infused water on the other side, right? Now, what if I take that same filter and I take a needle and now I poke hundreds of holes in that coffee filter, then I put the coffee grounds on. What happens when I pour the water over it?
Some of the coffee grounds go right through.
They're going to get through. So that's a visual on what it looks like to have a leaky gut. The junctions that seal the connections between the cells that are in the gut lining, those junctions loosen up. So now there's spaces in between the cells that are going to allow things to get through. Now, what can get through? Partially digested food proteins. So short chains of amino acids that are short enough to get through can get through. So you can get exposed to different food proteins, and that's how people develop food allergies, food sensitivities. But also you can get bacteria, bacterial DNA gets through. This has been measured in the blood of people. And you get also something called LPS, or lipopolysaccharide, which also goes by the name endotoxin. This is a really important concept in understanding the pathway of chronic inflammation that comes from the gut. Because once you have leaky gut, you've lost your border control. Now, things that are not supposed to get through are going to get through. And one of those things that can get through even more easily is that endotoxin. And the endotoxin is going to stimulate your white blood cells. It's going to activate them. It's going to make them secrete all sorts of inflammatory substances that are going to make you feel like you're not going to feel like you have a cold or flu, but your brain is going to be foggy.
Yep.
You're going to feel tired. You're going to feel achy. Maybe your joints don't feel good. Maybe you're gaining weight. So they've found a correlation between measuring LPS in the blood and consequent obesity, metabolic syndrome, eventually leading to diabetes. So there's a connection between endotoxin LPS and the evolution of disease that eventually can lead to diabetes.
I guess the question I have is, right, is it that there's a very specific hole that happens in one place, or is it systemic, meaning it happens slowly?
No, I mean, you have to think like your gut lining is huge, right? The small intestine alone has the surface area that can equate to almost a tennis court. So if you stood on a tennis court, and you see how big it is, well, imagine that entire tennis court is wrinkled down and made into a long tube and folded in, and it's inside here, inside your belly. That is the surface area of the small intestine alone. When you start developing leaky gut, in the beginning, it might be a patch here, a patch there, a patch over here. It's not going to be continuous. But over time, the sicker the person is, the more those patches are going to get bigger and the more leaky gut is going to be present. Your body's always trying to heal itself, right? You cut yourself, what happens? I just had an accident recently where I fell off a bike and like my palms, like it's kind of cool. Like I watched my skin reheal itself. It happens automatically. Our body constantly is trying to heal itself. It's going to be doing the same thing in the gut. The problem is when the balance is shifted, where the healing can't keep pace with the level of damage that's being inflicted upon the lining because you keep getting exposed to antibiotics, or you keep drinking too much alcohol, or you're taking that ibuprofen because your back is aching all the time. So kind of getting a repetitive injury to the gut. Or you've had a food poisoning that disrupted the gut lining and now you've got autoantibodies, because you can also develop antibodies to proteins that are structural proteins that hold the cells together. And your body can actually create antibodies that attack those proteins. And by doing that, then your body's going to be attacking self and cause leaky gut. So there's a different pathway for leaky gut. It's a bit rarer, but it happens in people who have been exposed to a food poisoning with E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, Shigella, those types of bugs that produce something called a cytolethal distending toxin. So there's different pathways to leaky gut. There's not just one way that we can develop leaky gut. But once you have leaky gut, then that is an overriding condition that is behind almost every single chronic inflammatory disease that we face.
We're going to jump into that in a second, but next question is, when you get leaky gut, does it get progressively better if I remove the stimulus, or does it, once it's there, it's in place?
Here's the concept that is really easy to remember. You need to weed, seed, and feed. So let's go back to the analogy of an ecosystem. So now I'm going to use the image of a garden. So imagine that your gut is this garden. Like any garden, you've got to tend to it, right? If you don't tend to the garden, plants are going to do well. You're going to have weeds growing in there. So we start by weeding because we want to remove the obstacles to healing. So what does weeding look like for us? Try to not take antibiotics if they're not necessary. Take out inflammatory foods, avoid vegetable oils, avoid processed foods, avoid food dyes, avoid eating too much sugar, avoid excessive alcohol. So that's the weeding part. You want to take out the things that are basically becoming the obstacles to your healing. Then the next part, the weed seed, seeding is making sure that your gut microbiome is supported. So think of the gut microbiome as the seeds. You're planting these seeds. Well, those seeds in our gut are the gut microbiome that is going to help take care of us. And how do we do that? By feeding it the right types of foods. Mm-hmm. So you're removing the bad things, trying to avoid pesticides, trying to avoid the things that we know that affect the gut in a negative way, and then bring in the good stuff.
Okay. And if you do that, you can reverse your leaky gut syndrome.
Yes. And the thing to understand about that, because I think people think like, oh, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to take a leaky gut formula. Like I've created a leaky gut formula. Like I'll do this for a month and I'm good. Yeah, but you're healing a surface area that's a tennis court.
A tennis court.
There's a lot to heal, and it takes time as a process. And you also have to uncover it's not just about the supplement. It's about looking in the mirror and recognizing the behaviors that you have that led to your condition in the first place. Mm-hmm. Like, how do you handle stress? Do you have stress management tools? Do you meditate? Do you exercise? Do you have ways to kind of lower, like rebalance your nervous system? What are the foods that you're eating? What are the types of thoughts that you hold? Because all of these things are going to affect how your healing journey goes.
How is it that if you practice meditating, if you have better stress management techniques, let's forget about fitness for a second, and let's forget about eating healthy, because those are almost like obvious things. How do those things help make sure that our tennis court worth of small or large intestine is actually healing?
When you do those things, you're attuning your nervous system, and very specifically, you're attuning the autonomic nervous system. Mm-hmm. So it's the part of the nervous system that we think is not under our control, but actually is under our control through things like the breath, through breath work, through meditation. So a lot of people that are walking around with gut issues have disrupted vagus nerve. Yep. So they have dysfunctional vagus nerve, low vagal tone. And how would you know this? Well, low vagal tone is associated with a whole host of things that people might not even think are related to low vagal tone. For example, depression is related to low vagal tone. And they've actually done studies where they've taken people who have treatment-resistant depression that are not responding to medication, so they've been on more than one medication, had them use a vagal nerve stimulation device, mm-hmm. and over the course of about 3 months, I think it was in the study, 37% of those reversed that were treatment resistant just by stimulating the vagus nerve. Well, the vagus nerve controls gut permeability. So I talked about how gut permeability is affected by pesticides, antibiotics, disruptions in the gut microbiome, over-the-counter drugs that are available like ibuprofen, all that. Well, the other thing that we know that affects gut permeability is vagal tone. And we understand this from traumatic brain injury cases. When someone has a traumatic brain injury, within 30 minutes, their vagal tone drops and they get a huge rise in gut permeability and they get all this inflammation. So now, say they've had a traumatic brain injury, they've had a concussion, they're in the hospital, maybe in a coma, their brain is inflamed, and now their gut border opens up and allows all of this more of this inflammation to come into the body. But part of the mechanism is because of the vagus nerve. Now, people might not, how do you know if your vagus nerve is not functioning? Well, have you ever been so stressed that you lose your appetite? Or so stressed that you eat, but that food makes you sick, like it just doesn't sit well in the stomach? That's because you've lost vagal tone. Because that vagus, when the tone is there and it's giving that signal, and I'm going to go back and date myself. I feel like now maybe it's like internet but if you think about like the old wired phones, when you picked it up, there was a tone.
Yep.
That tone told you that the phone was working. Well, that's kind of like your vagus nerve. There's a certain level of tone that needs to exist where it's sending impulses down from the brain to your inner organs, and it controls things like stomach acid secretion, the secretion of digestive enzymes, the movement, the rhythmic contractions of the gut. So if you have low vagal tone, you're going to get maybe nauseous, food's not going to sit well, you're not going to be able to digest that steak, you're going to get constipated, you're not going to go to the bathroom as much, you might start gaining weight, you might not feel well, you might be anxious, you might have depression. So all of these things are signs of disruptions in vagal tone. So it's very important, so you start appreciating that there's a multifactorial influence on how our gut is functioning. So it's not just about like, I'm going to take this leaky gut formula and it's going to help me. No, you've got to address all everything. Aspects. You've got to weed, seed, feed. You've got to look at how stress is affecting you. There's a study that was done that I wrote about where they looked at people going out into nature, even just spending time in the park. And they were quantifying, they were measuring blood cortisol levels. And they found that there was a sweet spot that actually dropped blood cortisol levels. And the sweet spot was 20 to 30 minutes in nature, which could be just going and taking a stroll in the park 3 times per week.
Yep.
20 to 30 minutes, 3 times per week, dropped blood cortisol levels.
No stimulant. I'm guessing no headphones, no nothing.
No, like just being
walking.
Like the study was be present in nature, like go sit on a bench, connect with nature, listen to the birds, like, just be out in nature. And that dropped blood cortisol levels. So, we have so many studies showing positive changes, even in the gut microbiome from meditation itself.
It's so interesting. Guys come to us all the time and they say, hey, I don't feel right. And they say, I want that shot. And we're like, wait. Tell us about what's happening in the rest of your life. How are you handling stress? How are you eating? How much alcohol are you consuming? How much are you smoking? And what people hate to hear is, if you just slept better, if you just drank some more water, if you just had 2,000 steps per day, not a ton, if you just made sure that you cut the alcohol consumption out, if you just had happy thoughts and managed your stress, honestly, your life would be so much better. And I think what people didn't realize previously that is coming to the forefront is that it is this multifactorial approach of making sure that you are doing all the tactics right, but more importantly, that you have the right mindset.
Yeah.
And I think
there's no magic bullet.
There is no magic bullet. And I think that there's actually 3 things that you've said that I will literally take with me for the rest of my life. 1, the rainforest. I like to think I have a rainforest inside my body. 2, the fact that I have a tennis court.
One too.
Okay, all right. The other one is that the fact that I have a tennis court to tend to, and that if I don't tend to that tennis court, the entire thing, which is 1 cell thick.
Imagine that garden is as big as a tennis court.
That's what I want to believe.
And you're tending to the soil, you're tending to the plants, you're getting rid of weeds. And it's not something that you do once and then you're done. It's an ongoing process.
Lifelong.
Right?
100%. It's a lifestyle.
It's an ongoing process. The other thing that I want to kind of get you to wrap your mind around is that the Milky Way galaxy has 400 billion stars, right? That's a lot of stars. So if you've ever been out at, like, the most impressive thing that I ever saw was driving from LA to Las Vegas and stopping in the middle of the Mojave Desert because we had to pee. And then just being shocked when we looked up in the sky.
Overwhelming.
Because there were no street lights and you could see the Milky Way. It was the first time in my life, I was 20 some years old, the first time I had ever seen the Milky Way. Because you can't see it with our light pollution. 400 billion stars, 100 trillion bacteria inside your gut. So another thing that I like to tell people is you have your own personal galaxy inside your gut. And if you know that you have this personal quantum galaxy inside your gut, how would you treat it? Like it's quite special. We're programming that gut microbiome by the foods that we eat and also by the timing of the foods that we eat. So we're imprinting the circadian rhythm of the microbiome by when we eat. From the perspective of the gut, it's very important to eat consistently within certain eating windows. Not be like a person that one day you eat lunch at 12, the next day you're too busy, so at 3 p.m. you're grabbing a smoothie because you never had time to sit down for lunch. And then the next day it's 4 p.m. and then the following day it's another time. Well, you're confusing the hell out of your gut microbiome. They're like, What is going on? Is it daylight? Is it nighttime? Is it noon? Is it like afternoon? Because we program the circadian rhythm of our gut microbiome by the way that we eat and the timing of what we eat. So we're controlling the makeup of the gut microbiome by the foods that you eat, the types of foods, and we can talk about that, like the role of diversity in the gut microbiome and how do you create diversity. And then by the timing of when we eat is very important and can actually, by disrupting the timing of when you eat, you can actually cause shifts in the microbiome that will cause more insulin resistance, more metabolic syndrome. And I see that in my patients who travel across time zones a lot. And you think that, well, it's because I'm in business dinners and all that's why I gain weight, but you're also gaining weight because you're actually disrupting the balance in the gut microbiome.
Someone said something to me that stuck with me really well. They said, eat like a dog. And when I first heard it, I was almost maybe a little bit offended, and it almost sounded a little bit too colorful. But they said, no, how do you feed your dogs? And I said, well, they get fed at 8 in the morning, they get fed at noon, they get fed at 5, and that's it. No ifs, ands, or buts, every single day. There's one thing, though, I think that it's really important for people to understand. You talk about leaky gut syndrome, you say it's bad, you talk about how it increases inflammation, so what? Right. And I think that what we're really beginning to understand is that all of these really bad chronic diseases, dementia, or diabetes, cardiovascular disease, they really are all a function of inflammation. Let's pretend I have leaky gut syndrome because I haven't been taking care of myself. My tennis court it looks bad. There's no jungle.
You're stressed out, you've got work dinners, you have multiple drinks per week, you're always entertaining clients, you've got bit of fat in the middle, right? So you've got leaky gut, you've got LPS, endotoxemia. It's activating your white blood cells, but also those fat cells in your belly are also producing the same chemical signals as your immune system. So your body is in this chronic state of inflammation. And those fat cells also produce an enzyme called aromatase, which is going to take your testosterone and convert it into estrogen. And it's a one-way path. Now that estrogen needs to get metabolized, so both men and women make estrogen. So that estrogen gets metabolized through phase 1, phase 2 liver detox. Hopefully that's working well. Gets pocketed and put into the bile and then excreted into the gut. Well, if your gut is off balance and there's certain, we'll call them bad gut bugs, that produce an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase, then that packaged estrogen that has been made water soluble so that it can exit the body in your poop is going to now be made fat soluble again, and it's going to recirculate back into your body because of these bad gut bugs. So now you're getting estrogen dominant, and you get something like prostate enlargement, and you start having symptoms of going to the bathroom and problems with that. So now you see how it becomes this whole interconnected domino effect.
The way I follow that down is, increased estrogen, all of a sudden your hypothalamus is saying, hey, too much estrogen in my body. It's going to tell my pituitary to stop producing LH. LH is going to decrease. That means my testes are going to say, hey, I don't need to produce any more testosterone. Your testosterone level goes down. Inflammation actually increases from that too, because you continue to only add more weight as well too.
Yeah.
And so I can see the whole cascade of events.
And you're stressed out.
And you're stressed out constantly.
You're stressed out. You've got little kids at home, trying to keep the wife happy. I'm stereotyping, but it's a story that I've seen so many times.
And I'm going to ask this other question too. Would you say that women or men are better at tending to their garden?
I would say that women are probably more aware of it. And I think because women tend to have a lot of bloating and a lot of gut health issues. So, and overall, the main health seekers tend to be women. Men tend to let things go on for much longer before they finally decide, oh, I need to do something about this.
Yep.
You know, they kind of let the first alarm signal, nope, not strong enough. Second alarm, nope, still not strong enough. Third alarm, yeah, I can still ignore that. I'll keep going out with my buddies. Fourth alarm, okay, I'm not doing so great. I need to go see the doctor. But women, they tend to, I think, I'm stereotyping, so I don't want to say that this is everyone because I'm a male and I've always been very health focused. So I think there are exceptions to the rule. But I find that men who are in relationships with a partner that pushes them to care for themselves tend to take better care of themselves than single men. And again, this is not going to be across the board everyone, but these are kind of like the general rule that I've seen over my clinical experience as a doctor. But there are exceptions. So I don't want to, if someone's listening, like, wait a second, I'm a male and I've been uber focused on my health for most of my life because I had so many gut issues growing up from having been on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics as a teenager. So I've always been on this seeking pathway of figuring out how can I be healthier.
So what are the things that I can do for my garden, which is forever, by the way, it's my garden from now on, to make sure that it is not, one, having a leaky gut, but also, two, really aiding in my longevity? And what are the pathways that activates?
Yeah. One of the really important concepts to remember is that diversity is the key to wellness. So when I say diversity, I'm talking about gut microbiome diversity. Diversity means the breadth and repertoire of bacteria that are represented in the gut. So the opposite of diversity would be a gut that's been exposed to multiple rounds of antibiotics. Diversity diminishes. And in people with diminished diversity, we see more gut health issues. We see more likelihood of inflammatory bowel disease, more likelihood of chronic inflammatory diseases, autoimmune disease. So in many ways, diversity is the holy grail. It's what we all should be seeking to either create or maintain over the lifetime. Now, we're still learning how we can create that diversity. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the hunter-gatherers because they have an incredibly diverse gut microbiome. Now, I'm not saying let's all go out and become hunter-gatherers, but one of the lessons that I learned from them is that part of the way diversity is created is from being out in nature, from not being overly clean, by not over sanitizing things, not over washing your hands. They don't wash their hands. They put their hands in dirt and stuff. And I actually went hunting and gathering with them. And one of the days we found root vegetables, dug them out of the ground, cut them up. We ate them right there. They were kind of sort of like jicama type of, like very watery, crunchy, like you didn't really have to cook it to eat it. But they're getting exposed to all sorts of microbes by doing that. And that's one of the ways to increase microbial diversity. The other way was pointed out by a study that was done at Stanford University, where they took a group of about 30-some people. They split them into two groups of 18. One group was put on a high fiber diet, and the other group was put on a high fermented food diet. So fermented foods are foods that are cultured, like kefir, kimchi, yogurt, kombucha, things like that. And so they looked at two really important things. Actually, they looked at three different things. So one, they looked at microbial diversity. So what happened before and at the end of the intervention? The whole study was about 17 weeks long. There was a 4-week ramp up, 10 weeks of being on the maintenance diet. So for the fiber group, their goal was to get to about 40 grams of fiber per day. Now, most people are eating less than 20 grams per day, so less than half of that. And most Americans are eating 10 to 15 grams of fiber per day, so not that much. On the fermented food side, the goal was to get them to 4 to 6 servings of fermented foods in some way or form. It could be something that they were drinking, like a vegetable brine drink, but 4 to 6 servings, which is quite a lot.
No fiber on this side, or that is fiber?
They weren't increasing they weren't focusing on fiber. So to make it, clean study, one group increase fiber, but not fermented foods. This group don't increase fiber, but you are getting some fiber from these foods, but increase fermented foods.
Mm-hmm.
Typical person that was enrolled in the study was having about 0.4 serving of fermented foods per day. So they then looked at what happened to microbial diversity, and they also decided, let's look at inflammatory markers and let's look at immune activation. And what they found was that, and actually almost surprisingly to me, because I thought for certain, like we hear, like, well, fiber is prebiotic for our gut microbiome. It's like fish food for our gut bacteria. So that's what we need. That's probably going to have the best results, like increasing fiber. Like that's the key. Well, it wasn't. It was the high fermented foods group that had the greatest drop in inflammatory markers. So they looked at 19 different inflammatory markers, including cellular immune activation of macrophages, and all sorts of, like C-reactive protein, things like that. And their microbial diversity increased. They've dropped 19 inflammatory markers. Now, what did the fiber-rich group do? Fiber-rich group modulated the immune response. And it was interesting because they decided, well, is this the same across all participants in the high fiber diet? So they decided, well, let's split them into 3 groups. Let's look at their baseline microbial diversity before they started the study. And they found that they could actually split them into high, moderate, and low.
Mm-hmm.
They found that the group with the highest microbial diversity, when they started the study and went on a high fiber diet, actually had the best immune modulation, actually calmed down the immune system. So fiber does play a role. From this study, we can conclude that fiber plays some sort of role in modulating the way our immune system is functioning, because the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that 80% of our immune system is all along the gut lining. So it is command central for our immune system. If you want to quiet your immune system is overactivated because you have autoimmune disease, you need to focus on your gut, because that is command central for the immune system. But the fermented foods group showed us that that's how we increase microbial diversity. Now, I would add to that getting out in nature.
Yep.
If you can have your own garden, like I have a garden here in New York, and I've got my own vegetables growing on organic soil, so I know where it came from. If there's a little bit of dirt on my vegetable, I'll wash it a little bit, but I'm not going to take everything off, because I know that dirt is also helping to modify and improve my microbial diversity.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is, if you almost live in too much of a bubble per se, and you're not exposing yourself to a varied group of responses, it actually doesn't necessarily help us. It may even hurt us to a certain degree. And I think that the takeaway that I'm almost kind of gathering from you is, I have like this beautiful image of this garden that I have to tend to that's incredibly fickle every single day, that it is multifaceted in how I take care of it. It's not just the light, it's not just the soil, it's not just how much water I give it, which are the equivalent of food, diet, stress response. It really is a combination of all those things.
Everything.
And the thing that's also really interesting too is that the way to take care of it to a certain degree is, and this is going to be oversimplifying it, is by eating dirt and yogurt. Right? Which is not a true statement in itself, but it is.
Don't be afraid to get dirty. And probably most people listening to this are not getting enough fermented foods in their diet. Now, granted, I want to just throw a caveat out there, because there are a lot of people who are suffering from certain gut issues like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, from histamine sensitivity, mast cell activation. Those people might not be able to tolerate certain fermented foods or any fermented foods because of histamine issues. So that's partly why when I wrote my second book, The Gut Smart Protocol, I put in a quiz that basically helps you learn what level of gut dysfunction you have that's not just affecting your gut, but the rest of your body. And I divide it into severe, moderate, and mild. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take the quiz and you fall under the severe category, and you go and then look at the food list chapter that has, I tried to put as many foods in there, almost every food under the sun, even worldwide, you're going to see that the part that has fermented foods is blank. So if you have severe gut issues, you can't have fermented foods. Your gut is not ready for it. You've got to do some groundwork, some soil mending, and cleaning up the diet, start to do some gut healing, and then you can start to introduce fermented foods little by little.
Now, the last question for you. You've got all these tools in your toolkit. You index on gut health. When you're thinking about your own health stack or protocol, and you could keep one thing and only one thing, and you can pass on this one thing to as many people as possible. You wave a wand and all of a sudden they're doing it. What is that one thing?
I think the most important balancing tool, because when you do this, then it has a very powerful downstream effect that influences the way you live your life and the choices that you make. That would be meditation, daily meditation.
It's funny, that's mine. I tell people that all the time. It is.
Because if you meditate every day, then you're choosing to live your life with intention and consciousness. And then if you can then translate that into choosing to eat with intention and consciousness, and choosing the supplements that you take with intention and consciousness, then to me, and also choosing the thoughts that you think with intention and consciousness. I try to teach this to my son, who is now 18, all the time, is, and it's not about, I think we talked about weeding, seeding, feeding, right? Another important thing to weed out is the constant chatter of negative thoughts that goes on in the head. And it's not also about suppressing, because I think it's also, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling annoyed, it's very important to identify, acknowledge, and give space for those feelings to exist. But you don't want to fill your mind with that. And so you have to be your own filter. You have to have some level of filtration, just like the gut, controlling the thoughts that are allowed to get in and infuse into your body.
So many people want the punch list from you, and they want the punch list to say, what should I do? And I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. And I think what people don't realize, and this goes back to everyone being so incredibly unique in where they are in life, you got to take the punch list and use it as an outline to get started. But the reality is you have to listen to what's going on inside of you in order to say, you know what, items 6, 7, and 9 on the punch list, not good for me. Let me get rid of it. Perfectly fine. Let me actually think about what are the things that are working for me. And you actually want to reduce that punch list to the fewest number of things that work for you, and then go figure out how to add 1 or 2 from another list and come up with your own personal stack.
That's what I did with my book, The Gut Smart Protocol. And I talk a lot about intuitive eating, but also I divide it into 3 things: pre-meal intuition, during meal intuition, and post-meal intuition. It's very important to have all of those aspects of intuition when it comes to taking care of yourself, or even just deciding, like, what do you want to eat? Like, before your meal, what are you craving? Like tuning into that inner intelligence. Now people will kind of, be the devil's advocate and say, well, I'm craving a cookie. Should I eat that? Like, no, tune into the real intelligence inside of you that knows what you need, what you want. Like I always felt that when I would go to do a yoga class and do an hour-long yoga class, end with a meditation. And then I would leave that yoga class and I realized that I only wanted to eat greens and really light foods. Like my body, there was a wisdom about, and I knew exactly what I was craving in that moment. And then during meal intuition, like really tuning in, like being present with the food that you're eating and recognizing, is this sitting okay with me? Is this not sitting okay with me? And then post meal intuition being like an hour later, like, did this sit well? Do I feel good? Or I'm not feeling well now. Oh, wait, should I connect it to what I just ate for lunch?
Yep.
Wait, what did I have for lunch? I had a salad, but I also had potato chips today because I really wanted those potato chips. And now I'm feeling kind of groggy and tired. And okay, so start making those connections, and that's how you build your intuitive wisdom to know what is it that your body really wants, what is it that is going to feed your body in the best way possible. And also, I like that you'll let yourself have a bite or two of dessert. Like, I think being over dogmatic, over restrictive
100%.
creates a feeling of like you're like this, and then it just leads to an explosion and a binge at some point. So I think it's important to allow things in moderation. And what I found is that I've been gluten-free since 2007, but I've been more strictly gluten-free since probably the last 5 years. And what I found was the biggest choice that really fortified it for me was a pro-health choice. So it was no longer that I'm avoiding gluten, it's that I'm choosing my health. And by choosing my health and putting my health as the highest priority, and how I want to feel, so that comes into the post-meal intuition. Well, how do I want to feel after I eat a meal?
Yes.
How do I want to feel the next day when I wake up? That started factoring into, well, you know what? It's not worth it because I know how I'm going to feel later. And so I can pass, or I'm going to make a different choice, and choose the foods that are healthy for me. One time it took my sister a long time to understand that I was gluten-free. So I went to visit her and the kids, and they're like, oh, let's go to an Italian restaurant for dinner. I'm like, I don't want to be that guy. Like, no, I can't. So I don't want to like destroy the plans when it's like 7 people and I'm the one.
Yep.
Like, So we go to the Italian restaurant and look at the menu. I didn't really want to have gluten-free pasta because a lot of the ones that you will get at a restaurant are made with corn, so not so great for you. And I've actually, by the way, had a celiac patient who reacted to a gluten-free pasta that was made from corn. So some people who are gluten sensitive can react to corn as well. So you have to be careful with that. And so I order a salad with protein. And afterwards she says, you have food issues. I'm like, no, I eat a lot of the foods that I know I can eat and that make me feel good. And I avoid the things that I know are bad for me. So I don't have food issues. I just choose wisely what I can eat and what I want to eat because I know I'm going to feel good when I do.
Well, look, I would literally talk to you for the next 3 hours because there's so many more questions I have, Dr. Vincent, but you've been amazing. You've given us so many good ways to think about our gut health.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation.